Oh, welcome to the lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss transphobia, and I will specifically talk about the murder of Brandon Tina, which is written about by Halberstam in the book Queer in a Queer Time and Place. And I will also talk about theories of violence. I hope you are all doing well. And just a warning, the lecture will perhaps contain graphic descriptions of violence, such as murder. And this is in the interest of discussing consequential and important cases of human rights violations, and thinking about the ways that theoretical and philosophical approaches to human rights and to transgender rights, to queer rights, to the rights of two-spirit people, um, are important in addressing uh, cases of systemic discrimination and violence. Thank you. So, violence is a really interesting set of ideas or philosophical debates. Theories of violence are discussed in sociology from the perspective of conflict theory. Uh, Philosophers have long debated violence, so have psychologists and criminologists. Um, and I will discuss violence in relation to cases such as the murder of Brandon Tina in Nebraska in 1993. Um, and I will discuss the ways that violence and uh, the killing of persons, the maiming of persons, sexual violence, such as rape, has actually become central to the ways that uh, gendered and sexual subjects who are deemed to be deviant or abnormal are regulated in our time. So, in the previous lecture, I discussed Michel Foucault and the history of sexuality. And Foucault was interested in the ways that acts became modes of personhood. So, in the 18th century, uh, an act um, would have been a sex act. And in the 19th century, what Foucault argues is that the way that people had sex was no longer an act. It became a facet of identity. So that if you were engaged in, say, sex acts, like two men engaged in sex acts in Europe in the 18th century would have just been two people who engaged in certain acts. But in the 19th century, with the rise of modern law, the modern nation state, and colonialism, these acts became modes of personhood. So you would have been deemed to be a gay man. And there would have been a whole set of texts, discourses, ideas, institutions that surrounded this form of personhood. The positive thing about personhood, obviously, is rights. That if you have a name, then your name can confer rights. So if you are a persecuted ethnic minority, a person who is, say, a tribal or Adivasi person in India, you will be given, say, a certain name. And your name is, say, someone who has title to forest land would then give you a whole series of claims in court. If you were not given that name, then your rebellion against the development of forest land by the state would not be intelligible as a kind of political identity. Your acts of trying to occupy this land would have just be seen to be criminal behavior. But having this name means you can articulate yourself and your demands. So transgender people, queer people, two-spirit people, lesbian and gay people can mobilize and can enact a set of claims for rights, the right to marry, the right to have fair employment equity, the right to be treated with respect, the right to have others respect pronouns. And in Canada, the term that I'm familiar with that is most often used is two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning. Um, and Two Spirit is obviously listed first in most official uses of this term in workplaces, in schools. So the terms vary. So gay is often the term that people use in context where English is not the first language. There are also localized terms in local languages. The point of having personhood is that it confers rights and human rights. The problem with having personhood is that when you are judged as a certain type of person, irrespective of whether someone sees you engaged in certain acts, you can be subject to violence. So claiming this identity or having this identity be thrust upon you as a minority means that you can claim pride in it and you can claim rights. And the hope is that when people say use these terms, two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, that they are not using them in negative ways and that they have accepted the spirit of the Canadian law, which recognizes the full rights of personhood for a whole host of queer actors and bodies. The problem is that if someone does not believe in the law and they are willing to engage in, say, criminal activities against queer people, then there can be violence. Theories of violence are also interesting when we think about social movements. So if someone is in a situation of spousal abuse or domestic violence and they assault their abuser. If they're a child and they're trying to flee extreme cases of child abuse and they assault their abuser, is this violence? In the eyes of the law, it would be termed self-defense. But the ways that we understand certain violence to be justified as opposed to others is really a political question, and it often forms the basis of our political beliefs. So if we are left wing or right wing, if we believe in the rights of two-spirit, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning people, we might feel as though um, someone is justified in defending themselves against their attacker using violence. So I will discuss the murder of Brandon Tina, which is written about by Halberstam in the book In a Queer Time and Place. And I will talk about the relationship between class, race, the history of slavery, and the politics of cisnormativity and heteronormativity in the United States of America. And I'll draw on lots of visual examples, including interviews with people such as Halberstam discussing academic scholarship and its relationship to transgender rights and to queer rights. Um, I will also draw on clips that discuss legal cases that are ongoing in the United States of America regarding transgender rights. And we have already discussed intersectionality as well in the class. So I will talk about transgender rights and queer rights from an intersectional perspective. Judith Butler's text, The Force of Non-Violence, discusses nonviolence and the kind of skeptical or cynical responses that emerge to the idea of nonviolence across political divides of left wing and right wing. So both the left and right wing, and many people who are engaged in or even oppose social movements are often skeptical of non-violence. Judith Butler writes, the case for non-violence encounters skeptical responses from across the political spectrum. There are those on the left who claim that violence alone has the power to effect radical social and economic transformation, and others who claim more modestly that violence should remain one of the tactics at our disposal to bring about such change. One can put forth arguments in favor of nonviolence or alternately the instrumental or strategic use of violence, but those arguments can only be conducted in public if there is general agreement on what constitutes violence and non-violence. One major challenge faced by those in favor of nonviolence is that, quote, violence and, quote, nonviolence are disputed terms. For instance, some people call wounding acts of speech violence, whereas others claim that language, except in the case of explicit threats, cannot properly be called violent. And this has been a central debate which I discussed in previous lectures regarding the use of proper gender pronouns for non-binary people and trans people. And this is enshrined in our law. So Bill C-16 adds gender identity and gender expression to the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code. And so one is asked in workplaces and schools, in public institutions, in doing everyday business with people to use their proper gender pronouns if possible. And if one is corrected, they're asked to then make a note of someone's proper pronouns when doing business in Canada. So I will discuss 3 points, theories of violence, then I will talk about Brandon Tina and class and space, and then I will talk about the Brandon Archive. Firstly, theories of violence. So Butler's work regarding nonviolence is interesting in the sense that the author discusses race and racial violence in detail. And Judith Butler discusses the ways that we often understand protests, like the mass uprisings by Black Lives Matter following the murder of George Floyd in the United States of America, that these protests are often depicted in mainstream news media as violence. And Judith Butler disputes this by looking at the ways that freedom of expression is understood and made sense of and represented in the US media very differently, depending upon whose freedom it is and whose expression it is. Judith Butler states that if a demonstration in support of freedom of expression, a demonstration that exercises that very freedom, is called violent, that can only be because the power that misuses language that way seeks to secure its own monopoly on violence through maligning the opposition, justifying the use of police, army, or security forces against those who seek to exercise and defend freedom in that way. American Studies scholar Chandan Reddy has argued that the form taken by liberal modernity in the United States posits the state as a guarantee of a freedom from violence that fundamentally depends on unleashing violence against racial minorities and against all peoples characterized as irrational and outside the national norm. The state, in his view, is founded in racial violence that continues to inflict it against minorities in systematic ways. Thus, racial violence is understood to serve the state's self-defense. How often in the United States and elsewhere are Black and brown people on the street or in their homes called or deemed violent by police, who arrest them or gun them down, even when they are unarmed, even when they are walking or running away, when they are trying to make a complaint themselves or simply fall asleep. It is both curious and appalling, writes Butler, to see how the defense of violence works under such conditions, for the target has to be figured as a threat, a vessel of real or actual violence, in order for lethal police action to appear as self-defense. If the person was not doing anything demonstrably violent, then perhaps the person is simply figured as violent, as a violent kind of person, or as pure violence embodied in and by that person. The latter claim manifests racism more often than not. So, deeming a person to be a threat to the state or a threat to themselves justifies violent state and police intervention. So if someone is deemed to be a threat because of their protest or because of their religion, because of their political beliefs, then the state can intervene. When someone is deemed to be a threat to themselves, as in the case of as we've discussed in relation to negative and untrue media accounts of Indigenous women and girls who are often seen to be a threat to themselves because of alcohol consumption or because of high risk sexual relationships, then the church has often been used historically in Canada to forcibly convert Indigenous people to Christianity or Catholicism. Invasive forms of healthcare, uh, paternalism by Canada's institution is used so that these people do not supposedly harm themselves. Ultimately, though, the arbitrator of this violence and the construction of this personhood is the settler state. So Slavoj Žižek has written a book called Violence, Six Sideways Reflections. And in the book, Žižek discusses the relationship between subjective and objective violence. Slavoj Žižek draws a distinction between what he calls subjective violence and objective violence. Ultimately, Žižek claims that subjective forms of violence actually detract from public notice of objective forms of violence that are often caused by systemic issues. So, the murder of Cindy Gladue is a case that we discussed in the first lecture. And Cindy Gladue was found dead in an Edmonton motel room. Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native girl and, quote, a native prostitute over 50 times in a court of law. Cindy Gladue was not referred to as a Cree person. Bradley Barton was not referred to as a white Canadian settler. He was not referred to as a Christian man. He was not referred to as a rapist, even though he was eventually referred to as these things in the Supreme Court of Canada after many, many trials and protests, and he was finally found guilty and he was referred to as guilty, finally. But in the Ontario courts, which tried to free Bradley Barton, Barton was not referred to as a white man. And it's interesting to think of in relation to Canada's geography and the class structure. Uh, so Cindy Gladue being referred to as, quote, a native girl and, quote, a native prostitute in Ontario is interesting if we think about how the class structure in one of Canada's, say, most expensive provinces and cities, which is Ontario and Toronto, does not necessarily change. And when someone is a victim of acts of violent crime, particularly women, is it possible that the courts of law want to blame a victim who is a victim of sexual violence and murder in order to uphold uh, certain norms that protect those who are most likely to own property and those who are most likely to be middle class and have money in Ontario, like such as white men like Bradley Barton. Um, and so we can think about the ways that the class structure, um, the ideology of the ruling class which will uphold the interests of the ruling class, structures these cases of subjective violence. Um, why was Cindy Gladue with Bradley Barton? If Indigenous people end up in high risk situations with settlers who do kill them, why have they ended up in these high risk situations? Um, Sex work, for example, is a really uh, hotly debated issue within the feminist movement. And many feminist thinkers argue for the decriminalization of sex work in order to prevent the murder of sex workers and to regulate a very high risk industry. So these subjective cases of the murder of women um, are also connected to an objective form of violence that often refuses to regulate industries that we know exist. So if one knows that sex work as an industry does exist, and it often does offer employment for women and two-spirit people, transgender people, queer people who are working class or poor, then is it not negligent to ignore this entire industry and to then wait until people die in a highly unregulated, high-risk occupation? This is a clip about violence, and it is a clip.
Again, welcome.
Let me share it again. Hope this works.
Again, welcome. We're very honored to have with us today a noted sociologist, philosopher, cultural critic, Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj is a senior researcher at the Institute of Sociology at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, a professor in the European Graduate School. He has been a visiting professor at several universities, including the University of Chicago, Columbia, Princeton, many others. And he's currently the international director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities at Birkbeck College in the University of London. The Wikipedian horde has deemed him an intellectual outsider and a confrontational maverick. And he comes to us today to discuss his recent book, Violence, a book which challenges us to look deeper into the topic of violence, to see beyond the ephemeral manifestations of violence, a gunshot, an explosion, the clash of metal on metal, bloodstains, and to discuss systemic violence, the violence inherent in our systems of living, our way of life. In a sense, our age is an age of the age of technological and biological exploration is an age of philosophical exploration as well. I know that many of us at Google are familiar with this. And to quote Slavoj himself, which I found on the internet, of course, the age of philosophy is in a sense, again, that we are confronted more and more often with philosophical problems at an everyday level. It is not just that you withdraw from daily life into a world of philosophical contemplation. On the contrary, you cannot find your way around daily life itself without answering certain philosophical questions. It is a unique time when everyone is, in a way, forced to be some kind of philosopher. So let's take this opportunity, please, for everyday philosophy and welcome Slavoj Žižek to Google.
I hope this works. Yeah. Thanks very much. I'm really glad of being here. You know why? Because let me begin with a funny association which came on my mind now. You know of what from my communist youth this scene here now reminds me. Under communism, when I was young, you not only had to work in factories and so on, but you had so-called hours of ideological education, you know, like exactly like now, like during lunchtime, workers has to see to some boring short talk which ruined your lunch about, I don't know, great results of our construction of socialism and so on and so on. I feel like back in old time, we're sorry for ruining your lunch. So in contrast to the kindness of the good guy who introduced me, I would say, please don't let me terrorize you. If your mind is with your computer, go on, go on. I would feel bad about it. What I was thinking about what to do here. Of course, I don't want to give the resume of a book. I never was able to be so arrogant. Like I know some guys, poets and so on, who treat themselves as classics, you know, like they open their own book, read a paragraph and say, let's now look at what the thinker wanted to say. No, the proper dialectical way to approach this book is, I think, to do the opposite of the book, to focus not on violence, but on what violence reacts to, usually on the everyday texture of our lives, everyday ideology. Now, your first reaction probably would have been here, but aren't we beyond ideology? I mean, am I an old Marxist from, you know, like the species which basically died around 1990, who still believed in big causes and so on? No, I will try to convince you that ideology is, of course, not in the sense of big worldview vision to impose on society, but ideology in the sense of a whole complicated network of ethical, political, social, whatever prejudices, which even if we are unaware of them, still determines the way we function, is still something which structures our lives. What is ideology? Maybe some of you know this, but I cannot resist repeating this story because it works perfectly. Namely, do you remember, you must, my God, it was endlessly reproduced on Google, that unfortunate interview of Donald Rumsfeld some 5 years ago, just before the Gulf War, when he wanted to explain where is the danger of Saddam, and he used his famous parallel. He basically developed a whole theory of knowledge, claiming that there are, you remember, knowns, things we know that we know. Then, like, we know that Saddam is the boss of Iraq. Then he went on, there are known unknowns. There are things we know that we don't know. Like, for example, I don't know. I know there are some cars in front of this building. but I don't know how many there are. But I know that I don't know this, no? Then he went on, there are unknown unknowns, in the sense of things that we even don't know that we don't know them. Like his idea was, the unknown was how many and where Saddam has his weapons of mass destruction. Like, we don't know, but we know that we don't know. But then his paranoia was, what if there are unknown unknowns, some secret weapons that we don't even know what they are? Get it? They're more radically unknown. Now, my claim is that, okay, that was his idea. My joke here is that if you have a little bit of a sense for structural analysis thinking, you see immediately that something is missing here, a fourth term. Known knowns, we know what we know. Known unknowns, we know what we don't know. Or then unknown unknowns, the totally other, like we don't even know what we don't know. Something is missing, the most interesting category. Not the known unknowns, but the unknown knowns. Not think we know that we don't know, but things we don't know that we know. That's the unconscious, that's ideology. All those silent prejudices which determine how we act, how we react, and we, in a way, they are so much the texture into which we are embedded that we literally don't even know that we know them. And I think this was why you were in such a trouble in Iraq. Not so much that there was some mystery that you didn't know. The US Army and administration basically didn't know what they already know. All the unconscious political, military prejudices, as it were, which determined their activity. Which is why, I don't know if some of you know it or not, to give you another example, I'm sorry of repeating myself, I hope you're a new public here. The analysis, because of which, and again, it was mocked endlessly in Google, it brought me some negative fame, but I still think it works perfectly, of this unknown knowns is the structure of toilets in our Western civilization. It's ideology at its purest. I will say, am I crazy? Where is ideology? Did you notice something? I simplified the analysis, but I know I simplified, but basically it holds, I claim. What do we get? We get three basic types of toilets. The French one, where, sorry for relative vulgarity, where the hole is in the back of the toilet so that shit falls directly into the hole and disappears. I mean, not the hole, I mean, not just the bowl, but the hole where then, get it. Then we have the German type where the hole where the shit disappears is in front. So that the shit is somehow displayed there. You know, Germans have all this ritual of, I'm not kidding, around 50% of toilet checky pub, if you go to Germany, are still structured like this, that the shit is displayed there and they have this old ritual. Every morning you should smell your shit, check it for traces of, Erika Young in her Sphere of Flying makes a wonderful comment. He said, she writes, a nation which had such toilets, no wonder they imagined Auschwitz and all the horrors. Okay, then you have the Anglo-Saxon, American and so on, toilets which are mixed. It's not, doesn't matter where the hole is because it's all full of water so that the shit floats freely there. Now, I was always intrigued by this. I asked my friends, architects in one of the other country, why this? And they tried to give me utilitarian answers. Like German said, isn't it natural to inspect your shit? French said, shit smells, let's get rid of it. Americans and Englishmen said, let's be practical, it should float in water so that it doesn't smell and so on. But obviously, it's not purely a utilitarian level. Then I ask myself a simple question. Where did I already hear this trinity? Let's call it a French, German, English, Anglo-Saxon civilization. Do you know that already 200 years ago, there was around Hegel's and French Revolution time, there was this popular idea among philosophers and so on about so-called European Trinity, claiming that the spiritual backbone or fundamental structure of Europe is composed of these three nations. Each of the three stands for a certain political principle and for a certain sphere of society. Germans are politically conservative, and sphere of society privilege there is Germans are a nation of poets, thinkers, and so on. Culture. France is revolutionary, and the preferred political sphere is politics. Anglo-Saxon universe is more, how to call it, liberal, centrist, utilitarian. The political sphere is economy. And then I got it. That's it. That's the key. French revolutionary, shit, disappear, liquidated as soon as possible. You Anglo-Saxon, more pragmatic, floated there, let's see how it's a Italian approach. Germans, metaphysical and poets, reflected and so on, conservative. And then I spoke with architects and they admitted it, crazy as it may sound. That's the only way to ultimately account for a totally vulgar object like the concrete structure of a toilet. You see now my point, which is slightly more serious, not only a tasteless joke, that even to account for the most elementary vulgar object, how it is structured, the whole, I wouldn't say worldview, but basic attitude towards civilization and so on, it's not just a utilitarian object. This is what interests me, this type of ideology. Ideology which is all this set of cultural and so on prejudices which structure our daily lives. And you don't even have to be fully aware of them, especially today in our so-called cynical era, where very interesting things are happening. How do we deal with ideology today? Maybe you know it, it's also endlessly in Google. The wonderful anecdote about Niels Bohr, Copenhagen, the quantum physics guy. The story is a wonderful one. The story is that once a friend visited him in Denmark, in the countryside where he had a house or go there to weekend, whatever. And the friend, also a scientist, saw above the entrance a horseshoe. I don't know how it is here, but in Europe, horseshoe above the entrance door is a sign of, it's a superstitious item destined to prevent evil spirits to enter the house. So the shocked friend asked him, wait a minute, are you crazy? Why do we have this here? Do you believe in it? Aren't you a scientist? Niels Bohr answered him, my God, I'm not crazy, I'm a scientist. Of course, I don't believe in this shit. Then the friend asked him, if you don't believe in it, why do you have it there? He gave a wonderful answer, Niels Bohr. He said, of course, I don't believe in it, but I have it there because I was told that it works even if you don't believe in it. That's how ideology functions today. We are all cynics. Who believes what and so on? But we somehow rely on it that it will work even if you don't believe in it. How should I put it? In this sense, we live in a cynical era, not cynical in the usual sense, bad people manipulating, but in much more refined way. We practice beliefs without believing in them, as it were. And this is what fascinates me in ideology, especially today. The old image of ideology was you have some explicit beliefs and then privately you let it know, oh, I'm not crazy as that, and so on. Today it's the opposite. What was once private is now public and vice versa. Privately, we like to play that we are not crazy to believe in some stupid ideology. What is ideology today, explicitly? I think some kind of a vaguely Dalai Lama spiritualized hedonism, no? It's no longer do this, sacrifice yourself, in spite of what Republicans are saying. They just react to it. Basically, ideology today is some kind of a vague injunction. Be truly yourself. Realize your potentials or whatever, and so on and so on. But I claim we believe much more than we appear to believe. We obey, or whichever way you put it, much more than we appear to do. And this, again, is what this tension between, let me call it, explicit beliefs or absence of beliefs, and this cobweb of, to put it in the terms of your great philosopher Donald Rumsfeld, of the unknown knowns, this is the crucial dimension. At the end, I hope I will have time, I would really like to mention briefly even the whole Sarah Palin phenomenon, I think, is, you cannot understand it without not toilets. Let's forget that, but it will, because, sorry. Okay, let me go a little bit further here. Did you notice another extremely interesting phenomenon about which I've written and which points in the same direction? What my friend, Austrian philosopher Robert Faller, you can Google him to be tasteless. You know, I will endlessly repeat this joke being here, at least on the German Google. You find him. He proposed a wonderful category of interpassivity. The idea is that it's not only that we like, in what we philosophers call cunning of reason, that we like manipulate others. So you sit back, others are active for you. Robert Faller drew attention to a much more mysterious phenomenon, opposite one, of what he calls interpassivity, where we transpose onto the other our passive reaction. Others are passive for us. The most elementary phenomenon, and I love it. I think this is arguably the greatest contribution of American civilization to world cultural heritage. Canned laughter on TV, you know, when just think about it. It's a much more mysterious phenomenon than it may appear. It's not, as some wrong Pavlovian psychologists think, the function of you hearing the laughter there as part of the soundtrack is not automatically to trigger your laughter. No, it works so that literally the TV set laughs for you. At least that's how it works with me. It's really the same thing as, you remember those, I always like them, in Tibetan Buddhism, those praying wheels or mills and so on, where you write down a prayer, you turn it around, or even better, you let the wind turn it around, and then you can masturbate, whatever, it doesn't matter. Objectively, you pray. You pray through it. Here it's the same. It lasts for you. That's my experience. You know, in the evening, you arrive home, that tired, you put on some stupid show with canned laughter on TV, cheers, friends, whatever, and you don't even laugh. The mystery is admitted. At the end of the show, you feel relieved as if you have laughed. That's the mystery, how it works. And my thesis, back to Donald Trump's topic, is that it's the same with beliefs. It's not so much that we believe. We need, as it were, another one to believe for us. This is how our rituals function. For example, take Santa Claus. I mean, of course, nobody believes. I mean, parents, if you ask parents, they say, no, we are not crazy. We pretend to believe not to disappoint our children. But I can guarantee you, if you ask them, the children, they said, no, I'm not crazy. We pretend to believe not to disappoint our parents and to get presents and so on. You got the point. Nobody has to believe. Only if every individual actually existing presupposes another agency to believe, then belief functions. The whole system of belief functions. The first to use this structure consciously, politically, it's, you know, the old Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, who, when asked, do you believe in God? Of course, she didn't. I mean, that's the irony. Israel, who makes his claim on the West Bank like God gave us this land, is, and I like it for that, avoid misunderstanding, it's the most atheist country in the world. According to statistics that I read there, about between 60 and 70% of the Israeli Jews don't believe in God. And the irony is that, so Golda Meir was asked this. Her answer was, no, I don't believe in God. No, she didn't answer. She just answered, I believe in Jewish people and Jewish people believe in God. But the point is that there are no individual Jews who have really to believe in God. Everybody just has to evoke this specter. And so the most terrifying experience is when you learn, not that you don't believe, but that the other, which was in a way the guarantor of your belief, doesn't believe. If you know a little bit of literature, that's so shocking. You remember Age of Innocence, Edith Wharton. At the end, the guy, okay, I speak in cinema terms, Daniel Day-Lewis, is told by his son that Winona Ryder, his dead wife, knew all the time about his affair with Michelle Pfeiffer, but pretended not to know. When he learns it, everything is ruined. That's, I think, our much more fundamental need than directly to believe. To have another one as protected innocence. So let me go on a little bit here after we return to ideology, to explicit ideology. How do these prejudices function? They are something much more complex than it may appear. Recently, 3 months, 2 ago, I gave a talk at Harvard. At the end of the talk, we were invited, this is the most boring part of academic meetings, where we had an official dinner where, people who are really bored by each other, you have to pretend and so on. So the older professor who was coordinating dinner, 10 of us, said, okay, since we don't know each other well, please, can everybody here present him or herself? State your name, position, state your work, field of interest, and your sexual orientation. Now, this shocked me a little bit. For my European sensitivity, my idea was almost, what's none of your business, no? But now I don't want to play the vulgar American bashing because, this bar of discretion is just different in Europe. Immediately.
We'll stop there. It's interesting to think about. I mean, the example that Slavoj Žižek gives of toilets, which is, I guess, a joke, or it's kind of an example that is often used to elicit some sort of kind of shock or interest from the public, but sex is also interesting to think about in ideological terms. So the way that different nation states and different religious groups make sense of sex itself in different historical time periods is also deeply ideological. So just like toilets, I mean, the way that we kind of look at sex across different countries and continents and historical time periods is kind of this really rudimentary thing. Like it's sex itself, much like any other scientific phenomenon, is it's very basic. It expresses the functioning of the body in a certain way. And obviously, the kind of ways that we choose to look at or refuse to look at sex, the names we ascribe to sex or the people who have certain sex acts will change depending on the political motivations behind those doing the naming, their class interests, and also the uses of religion for what I would argue are political purposes. Transgender rights and the ways that transgender rights are made sense of in Canada, as opposed to the United States of America, the ways that hijras are referred to as male to female transgender persons in India. There are also other terms like kotis, which refer to kind of non-binary people. The ways that these social actors have been made sense of historically in terms of religion is also really ideological in nature. And we've discussed Michel Foucault and Foucault's understanding of biopolitics and the ways that biology is central to nation building. So the state intervenes into our lives at all levels of life, warnings on nutritional packages, public health care, incentives for having children are all forms of biopolitics. The investment in transgender lives is also a form of Canadian biopolitics. And certain social actors are included into the life of the nation state. But biopolitics will obviously change depending upon national context. So the United States of America has ongoing debates regarding transgender rights, gay, lesbian rights, that are ongoing depending upon the state that you are in. The banning of abortion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health has overturned Roe versus Wade in the United States of America. So these questions about how nation states intervene into life are central to thinking about the meaning that is made out of sex and sexualities. The problem is that negative attachments to transgender people have often justified the killing of trans people. And transgender theorists have written extensively about trans necropolitics. So, biopolitics for Foucault is about the intervention of the state into the life of citizens and citizens who are invested in with public health care, with the Canada Food Guide, in order to prolong life expectancy and in order to give birth to future citizens who will participate fully in the workforce. Necropolitics refers to the politics of death, those whom we actively kill or let die. Most obvious example of Canadian settler necropolitics are the ongoing cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and what is referred to as genocide in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. Trans necropolitics has been written of extensively, and I'll discuss it in the remaining part of the lecture in relation to violence against transgender people and the politics of nation building. So the term biopolitics dates to the early 20th century, but it is only in Michel Foucault's work from the 1970s forward that the concept, sometimes denominated by him as biopower, begins to be considered a constitutive aspect of governance within Eurocentric modernity. Biopolitics, generally speaking, describes the calculus of costs and benefits through which the biological capacities of a population are optimally managed for state or state-like ends. In its Foucauldian formulation, the term refers specifically to the combination of disciplinary and excitatory practices aimed at each and every body, which results in the somatization by individuals of the bodily norms and ideals that regulate the entire population to which they belong. So, if we were to think about Slavoj Žižek's understanding of subjective and objective violence in relation to biopolitics, then there are these subjective instances in which Indigenous peoples, say, like Cindy Gladue, die. And Cindy Gladue was a Cree person who, at the age of 38, bled to death in an Edmonton motel room. And Bradley Barton was a white settler man who was accused of murdering Cindy Gladue. And this was one case of subjective violence. And the details of the case were really horrific and really gritty in the media. And so were the images that were used to accompany this case. But the objective violence obviously refers to nation building and settler colonial nation building in Canada. So the fact that Cindy Gladue was a Cree person who died at such a young age is perhaps part of Canada's ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. And this is kind of this is an example of settler biopolitics. So biopolitics can be thought of not only in relation to those lives that we invest in, but the divestment of state resources, of social support, of attention, of positive feeling towards groups of people like Indigenous peoples in Canada. In Foucauldian biopolitics, the individualizing and collectivizing poles of biopower are conjoined by the domain of sexuality, by which Foucault means reproductive capacity, as well as modes of subjective identification, the expression of desire, and the pursuit of erotic pleasure. Sexuality, in this double sense of the biological reproduction of new bodies and that make up the that make up the body politic, as well as the ensemble of techniques that produce individualized subjectivities available for aggression, supplies the capillary space for power circulation through the biopoliticized populace. So if we were to think about reproductive capacity, we can think about cases of Indigenous women being sterilized in settler Canada. So these collectivizing poles of biopower are conjoined by the domain of sexuality, by which Foucault means reproductive capacity, as well as modes of subjective identification, the expression of desire, the pursuit of erotic pleasure. So throughout the history of settler colonialism in Canada, Canada's uh, Indigenous people in settler Canada have actively been discriminated against as desiring subjects, as those who want to marry, as those who want to have children. In its most extreme invocation, settler colonialism has justified pedophilia, rape, forced sex work, sexual slavery, uh, and obviously the murder of one's rape victims, including children, in missionary-run schools. As it happens now, Canada is facing a whole series of class action lawsuits against settlers in the healthcare system and predominantly white settler women and men who have sterilized Canada's Indigenous women when they try to have children. So I will share my screen. And I guess the point for thinking about for the point in thinking about biopolitics and necropolitics in relation to nation building is that it allows us to think of the ways that sex, sexuality, desire are central to nation building. So more than just being the study of, say, different populations of people like Indigenous peoples, women, trans people, sex and sexuality, and the anxieties, the aggression, the violence directed towards certain desiring bodies are central to Canadian nation building, but central to every form of nation building. So that if you were interested in your further research at the graduate school level or in law school in thinking internationally, you can find examples in which sex and sexuality, anxieties, aggressions, and also positive affirmations of sexuality are always central to the politics of nationalism. So I will share my screen and we will discuss unfortunate cases of sterilization in Canada that have led to class action lawsuits. That are ongoing. So 1 year ago, the Canadian Senate passed a bill denouncing all forms of sterilization. And obviously, sterilization is against the law. Forced sterilization of any group of people is against international laws. But because of settler colonialism, Indigenous women have been actively discriminated against by healthcare providers. So these debates are ongoing at the level of party politics and legislation and lawsuits in Canada.
It's been a long journey to end the practice of doctors sterilizing Indigenous women against their will. A journey that led victims and advocates to the Senate last week, where a private member's bill passed third reading. A Senate report detailed what it calls horrific accounts of between 12 and 15,000 women, mostly Indigenous, being sterilized in the past 50 years. In some cases, going in for C-sections and finding out later doctors severed their fallopian tubes or removed reproductive organs without consent, something Nicole Rabbit and her late mother Mary both endured.
Someone has to be accountable for the act of genocide that we Indigenous people have faced and continue to face in regards to forced and coerced sterilization. Our human rights continue to be violated to this day.
A violation that could soon be a crime.
This is ultimate violence. When you remove someone's opportunity to give life, I don't know how you can be more violent.
This bill is going to prevent this from ever happening again. This is one step further toward ensuring that safety and that body autonomy for Indigenous young people is there.
It's a criminal act. In other countries, it's seen as a crime against humanity to forcefully or coercively sterilize any human being to the point where they can't reproduce. And so in Canada in 2024, it's important that the law recognizes the actual harm this causes an individual.
Senator Yvonne Boyer championed the bill, which now goes to the House of Commons, where supporters hope for swift passage ahead of the next election.
These women are committed to making sure not one more sister, mother, auntie, or daughter is subjected to forced or coerced sterilization.
Meanwhile, class action lawsuits continue in several provinces and territories where victims are seeking compensation for these violations. Melissa Ridgen, Global News, Winnipeg.
So these acts of invasive medical procedures against Indigenous women as part of an ongoing system of carceral violence and the use of institutions like the prison industrial complex, the healthcare system, the educational system as tools of genocide is part of Canada's ongoing settler history. So the use of, say, police to kill people like Neil Stonechild is something that we've discussed in previous lectures. And Neil Stonechild was an unarmed Indigenous man who was picked up by police in Saskatoon and left to freeze to death on the outskirts of Saskatoon. And this kind of police brutality also exists in healthcare. This use of institutions to regulate the population is a form of necropolitics. And so transgender theorists have also discussed the ways that necropolitics is used against trans people. And necropolitics is really about the divestment of certain lives in service of nation building. So in order to build a nation, you invest in certain lives as opposed to others. You also invest in the birth of certain children. You invest in the employment of certain people and not others. And obviously, there are a whole set of legal issues that arise, but systemic discrimination does not happen at one level or one time. Systemic discrimination often happens throughout the whole course of someone's life, where they are ignored or divested in or neglected. The killing of transgender people, recognized as an epidemic of violence by the American Medical Association in 2019 represents a significant crisis, with at least 57 transgender and gender nonconforming people killed in the U.S. in 2021 alone. These violent acts are frequently motivated by transphobia, with reported murders in the U.S. totaling 271 between 2008 and 2020, often involving severe physical and sexual violence. So, there are many authors who have discussed trans necropolitics. So, Herita Warren and Snorton write about trans necropolitics by using the concept of afterlife. Through the concept of the afterlife, their essay addresses the complex interrelationship between biopower and necropolitics, to consider the discursive and representational politics of trans death and trans vitality. Our formulation of trans necropolitics draws on Achille Mbembe's necropolitics, a concept he develops for making sense of the centrality of death in contemporary social life. So, necropolitics is something I will discuss in greater detail, and it is Achille Mbembe's concept that is often most well cited and is written after Foucault to discuss colonialism and the divestment of life of people in the colonies. And Achille Mbembe is a South African scholar who is interested in the ways that nation building in Europe involves a biopolitics that requires the divestment of lives of those under colonial rule in order to build a European nation state. And Mbembe's work goes on to discuss necropolitics within South Africa as well. So Herita Warren and Snorton go on to write that this enables us to understand how biopower, the carving out of subjects and populations, can profess itself at the service of life and yet generate death in both quotidien and spectacular forms. We also draw on current queer theorizing that attempts to make sense of the expansion of liberal LGBT politics and its complicity with racism, empire, border fortification, gentrification, incarceration, and the war on terror. So Jesper Puar wrote a very influential book in the field of queer theory. Puar's book, Terrorist Assemblages, Homo Nationalism in Queer Times, argues that the investment in gay and lesbian and transgender patriotism in the United States of America corresponds to the global war on terror. So the use of or the branding of certain nation states as being queer friendly also corresponds with the global war on terror and the pathologizing of certain nation states that are deemed to be violating human rights. And this violation of human rights then justifies U.S. imperial intervention. And this is the argument that Puar makes. Transphobia is really interesting in the sense that, I mean, it's obviously unfortunate and sad and against the law, but it is interesting to think about how different factions of political actors position themselves against and in relation to this object of scrutiny. In the same way that different factions of people and social actors use the image or the idea of the indigenous in the last few years, many different social actors have invoked the character of the trans person for their own political needs. In the United Kingdom, the term TERF, or trans exclusionary radical feminist, has been used uh, to discuss the ways that many people within institutions have tried to gain attention in the media, have tried to further their career interests by having an opinion about transgender people and rights. In the last few years, latent anti-trans sentiment within some corners of UK feminism has coalesced into a highly organized gender-critical movement that has seen considerable success in influencing policy and public debate. And this author argues that gender-critical feminism as a lobbying movement, examining its orientation towards governance and power, it argues that the gender-critical movement must be understood as a biopolitical project indebted both to sexological work aimed at normalizing trans and intersex minds and bodies, and to 1970s feminist responses to this work. So the TERF phenomenon has gained a lot of attention, and there have been cases of prominent celebrities, writers, who all have this kind of investment in a discourse regarding transgender rights. So, more than being acts, we can return to Foucault that in this time period, rather than just being judged by certain acts of, say, gender transgression, personhood is ascribed to gender non-conforming people. The problem is that with this, the positive or the useful thing about personhood is that it confers rights. But the problem is that when these names like trans or non-binary, begin to be used, they can be used against gender nonconforming people. So Fran Amory discusses gender critical feminism as a biopolitical project, and I've cited from Amory's work here. And Amory states that this project strives for the power to manage trans populations, both via direct surveillance of trans lives and indirectly via attempts to counter the supposed threat to a broader cis feminist population management project posed by trans identification. So Foucault's work regarding biopolitics is interesting in thinking about why TERFs are now central to media and why TERFs have been getting so much media attention in certain national contexts. And obviously, gender has become central to the politics of nation building in global North countries. Contemporary transgender identities, populations, and socio-political movements exemplify this process of biopolitical racialization. So what Herita Warren and Snorton and other transgender studies scholars also argue is that this form of biopolitics, this gendering of biopolitics is always racialized. And this is something that Puar has argued as well. So I'll play this clip about necropolitics, and I will finish the lecture by discussing the murder of Brandon Teena, who was found dead in Nebraska in 1993.
After releasing a video explaining what Foucault's notion of biopolitics is, many people responded by being like, explain necropolitics, explain necropolitics. Necropolitics, I know it best from Ishim Mbembe's work, specifically his text on necropolitics. in which he identifies the limits of Foucault's notion of biopolitics. And for those that don't know, just briefly, biopolitics refers to the act of organizing people, controlling them not through threatening violence or threatening force against them, but actually encouraging them to embrace certain identities that can then be controlled and mapped. So instead of treating people like essentially like subhumans that can be punished, treating them very much like humans that can be organized, mapped, and controlled in accordance with an identity that has been bestowed upon them. Now, Mbembe is not quite so satisfied with this. That is, Mbembe says that this totally discounts the ways in which so many people across the planet experience the threat of physical harm and actual physical harm all throughout their lives in all parts of the world, much at the hands of the West, the quote unquote West and global North, be it in the form of military violence or exploitative violence by companies going overseas to find cheap labor and putting people through horrendous working conditions there. Not everything is so glossy as Foucault seems to suggest, in organizing populations according to their identity categories or various identities that have been bestowed upon them. So what Mbembe does is open up a consideration of what he calls death worlds, worlds in which biopolitics hasn't really gotten a chance to enter yet, in which still the older form of control through direct physical harm is always threatened and is always present. Uses the case of Palestinian people and the continual fear that they experience under the weight of Western and Israeli power. And he suggests that this is just a totally oppressive system that they have absolutely no ability to really combat, given the disequilibrium in the amount of force that each possesses. And so with his version of necropolitics, I think that we find a very important antidote or even a counter to what Foucault offers us. To nuance this discussion, consider the ways in which biopolitics falls short in accounting for the many ways that force and oppression operate today. But yeah, let me know what you think. Do you think that one is better than the other? Do they really fit together? Can you apply this idea of necropolitics to your life? Is Foucault like totally wrong and we have to totally embrace Mbembe's idea of necropolitics? I'd love to hear about it. Yeah, if you want more on this, click the link in the first comment. Peace out. After releasing a video explaining what Foucault's
Okay, so the blog is called At Theory Philosophy, and it's David's blog or channel, which you can watch. And I've drawn on other clips, but that is about necropolitics. And I will discuss necropolitics also in other lectures. And so the lectures kind of build upon each other. And finally, I'll finish by discussing Brandon Tina. We began the class by looking at the murder of Cindy Gladue, and violence is unfortunately central to the struggle for sexual rights and freedoms. Violence is central to the struggle for sex workers' rights, and violence is central to the struggle for Indigenous peoples' rights and to transgender rights. And as I mentioned, Judith Butler has written this book, The Force of Nonviolence. And what Butler is interested in is how violence itself, and the ways that we perceive of who is or is not violent, is already worked upon in our minds. It's already worked upon philosophically and politically. It is February, which is Black History Month. The extrajudicial killing of Black people by police as a form of state protection rather than violence is obviously an idea or an ideology that supports the ideology of the ruling class and supports a racist settler state. Judith Butler writes both violence and nonviolence arrive in the fields of moral debate and political analysis already interpreted, worked over by prior usages. There is no way to avoid the demand to interpret both violence and nonviolence and to assess this distinction between them if we hope to oppose state violence and to reflect carefully on the justifiability of violent tactics on the left. As we wade into moral philosophy here, we find ourselves in the cross currents where moral and political philosophy meet, with consequences for both how we end up doing politics and what world we seek to help bring into being. One of the most popular arguments, writes Butler, on the left to defend the tactical use of violence begins with the claim that many people already live in the force field of violence. Because violence is already happening, the argument continues there's no real choice about whether or not to enter into violence through one's action. We are already inside the field of violence. According to that view, according to that view, the distance that moral deliberation takes on the question of whether or not to act in a violent way is a privilege and luxury, betraying something about the power of its own location. In that view, the consideration of violent action is not a choice, since one is already and unwillingly within the force field of violence. Because violence is happening all the time, and it is happening regularly to minorities, such resistance is but a form of counter-violence. Apart from a general and traditional left claim about the necessity of a violent struggle for revolutionary purposes, there are more specific justificatory strategies at work. Violence is happening against us. So we are justified in taking violent action against those who started the violence, A, started the violence, and B, directed it against us. We do this in the name of our own lives and our right to persist in the world. The problem is, from the perspective of politics, is people take violent action all the time because they feel that they're being threatened. But this is also true of those who feel that they are being threatened by minorities. So the white working class are social actors that many people often want to ignore when they make claims that are liberal and left wing. David Roediger has written a book called The Wages of Whiteness. And in this book, what Roediger argues is that the white working class often gains a wage by being white against the interests of immigrants, against the interests of people of color and indigenous peoples. Brandon Teena was killed in Nebraska in 1993. Brandon Teena was an American transgender man who was raped and later, along with Philip Devine and Lisa Lambert, murdered in Humboldt, Nebraska by John Lauder and Tom Nissen. His life and death are the subject of the films The Brandon Teena Story and Boys Don't Cry. Teena's murder, along with that of Matthew Shepard nearly 5 years later, led to increased lobbying for hate crimes in the United States. So the wages of heterosexuality could also be discussed in relation to murders of transgender people by working class men, such as Nissen and Lauder. And this kind of violence is discussed by Halberstam in relation to class in America. Brandon Teena was working class and had problems with the law. And Brandon Tina was not unknown to others in Nebraska, and specifically Falls City in Nebraska, where he presented as a man. And he was often known to those who also had problems with money. In 1993, after some legal trouble, Tina moved to the Falls City region of Richardson County, Nebraska, where he presented as a man. On December 19th, 1993, Tina was arrested for forging checks. And it was during a Christmas Eve party that Nissen and Lauder grabbed Tina and sexually assaulted and then murdered Tina. So this kind of violence is not easily understood as a form of aggression by those who say are the state against those who are subject to state violence. So in cases of police brutality, one can narrate the murder as being committed by the police against, say, those who are innocent civilians. But in these cases, it is often working class men who kill other working class men, as in the case of the murder of Brandon Tina. So this is a clip of Halberstam. And in their book, In a Queer Time and Place, Halberstam discusses the Brandon archive. And Halberstam states that our relations to place, like our relations to people, are studied with bias, riven with contradictions, and complicated by opaque emotional responses. So if we again return to the wage of whiteness, the people who were killed in the murder of Brandon Tina, including Brandon's friends, Philip Devine, Lisa Lambert, were not white cisgender heterosexual men, much like Bradley Barton, who murdered Cindy Gladue. We see a division between in we see a division within the working class. So the wage of whiteness that is gained, as David Roediger discusses, is a feeling of belonging, a feeling of superiority that allows the white working class to distance themselves between other workers, namely Black people and people of color. I would argue this wage of heterosexuality and cisnormativity is also what allows for this feeling of superiority. And when taken to extremes, this superiority leads to fascism, which justifies murder. On December 31st, 1993, three young people were shot to death, execution style, in Falls City in rural Nebraska. Ordinarily, this story would have evoked only mild interest from mainstream America and a few questions about the specific brutalities of rural America. One of the three victims, however, was a young white person who had been born a woman, but who was living as a man and had been dating local girls. So Halberstam really narrates this case as one of rural life and death. And we can think about it even in relation to the murder of Cindy Gladue, that if one has lived in rural Canada before, unfortunately, there are high rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, unemployment, and yes, sex work. And so perhaps these cases often make it to courts of law and media because of ongoing debates regarding rights within big cities. So, within cities like New York, there are often ongoing debates regarding transgender rights and queer rights, and uh, the rights of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are in the media and often are topics of public debate within major cities among the middle class and within university curriculums. Halberstam discusses the murder of Philip, who was Brandon Tina's friend, and the ways that the murder of Philip, who was a person of color who became friends with Brandon Tina, was often not discussed. And Lisa Lambert, who is also Tina's friend, was murdered by these two white cis men in Nebraska. And Brandon Tina's story, got a lot of attention, perhaps because of transgender rights and um, media attention regarding transgender rights. It is hard to detach the murder of Philip from the history of Nissen's involvement in white supremacist cults. Many accounts of white power movements in the United States connect them to small all-white towns in the Midwest and to economically disadvantaged white populations. While one would not want to demonize poor white rural Americans as any more bigoted than urban and suburban white yuppie populations in the United States, it is nonetheless important to highlight the particular fears and paranoia that take shape in rural all-white populations. In small towns where few people of color live, difference might be marked and remarked in relation to gender variance rather than racial diversity. So the fact that these two men knew these people in Nebraska in this small place where Brandon Tina actually went to hide after having troubles with the law and committing fraud financially or being accused of committing fraud is because of class. I mean, the fact that a nurse would be a nurse in, say, a very, very small rural town in, say, Saskatoon, and would have contact with an Indigenous person who is trying to give birth in a remote community is also about class and the politics of class antagonism. So I'll play a clip. Halberstam.
Healthy Planet, where your wellness journey begins. With the best selection of supplements.
Old Spice Super Hydration keeps me 24/7 moisturized and smells like a Fiji vacation.
The term trans bodies refers to the changing nature of gender in an era when large numbers of people are making changes to their bodies, either using hormones or using surgeries, or simply changing their gender pronoun or their name. And this has reached a certain critical pitch of intensity to the point where we now have to rethink what we mean by gender. And so I'm using the term trans asterisk to refer to the multiple ways in which the gendered body has changed, certainly over the last 50 years, but in an intense way over the last decade. The reception of this increasing number of trans bodies in public spaces has put pressure on the ways in which we only recognize gender in the form of a binary. So we think that a body that is not male is female, and a body that is not female is male. And I think especially among young people, that binary just doesn't hold anymore. And you see that there are many different inflections and nuances to gender identity. So the spatial crisis that this has created has to do with what, I called a long time ago the bathroom problem, which is where a social subject, is in a public space and is faced with a choice, the men's room or the women's room, and there's no other option. And so because of the wide range of gendered expressions, restrooms, toilets, public bathrooms have become overloaded in a way. The crisis around the bathroom is a reflection of a larger crisis in relationship to the gendered body. It's a very easily resolved crisis, quite honestly, because
bathrooms are making a division between types of bodies that basically is no longer relevant, male, female. It's not there aren't enough choices. So all you have to do is in any given space have a number of gender neutral bathrooms. And what you find is in spaces where there are gender neutral bathrooms, most people use the gender neutral bathroom. So it turns out that this seemingly natural division between male and female is a division that is anachronistic. It does not do the work that it used to do. In fact, it confuses the way in which people understand gender. There is a question as to what happens to heterosexuality when so many other forms of social gender, sexual identity are shifting and changing. Is it possible that heterosexuality simply stays the same? And no, it's not possible. One of the things that I've argued in my work is that when there are shifts and changes in one part of the culture in relationship to sexuality and gender, it has a ripple effect, and that changes everything in the culture. So if there are more trans people, then the binary gender form upon which heteronormativity depends is destabilized. And when it's destabilized, when it's no longer so clear who is a woman and who is a man, obviously, heterosexuality is also thrown into some kind of doubt. When marriage is not so central, reproduction, it does not require married monogamous relationships. What is the meaning of heterosexuality is a very good question. Well, you never know if heterosexuality is changing. That doesn't necessarily guarantee any particular outcome. It doesn't mean that, oh, this is the end of gender or this is the end of the family. But it is the end of any kind of presumed, inevitable, organic, natural relationship between men, women, marriage, babies, family life. That was an unquestioned paradigm, even as recently as a decade and a half ago. Now it's not an inevitable paradigm. And I think for young people, the trajectory of their lives is more unclear, more unpredictable, less tethered to family, marriage, and reproduction than it was. And this is a good thing because it opens up questions for people about what is my life to be, whereas heteronormativity always closed down questions. It was a script in advance. So I think this is, in many ways, it's a good thing for heterosexuals. Regardless of what happens for LGBT people, this is good for heterosexuals. And this is something we never talk about, the way in which normativity is, disciplines and punishes LGBT people, but it also constrains and confines heterosexual people. So by focusing upon the imposition of heteronormativity on heterosexual people, you see that many of these rigid norms are not good, not just for minorities, but for the majority of the society. And this is why they are destabilized now, because this is not a moment when young people definitively want to simply get married, have children, have a family. Nowadays, most marriages end in divorce. In the US, it's some 65% of all marriages end in divorce. So at that point, you'd have to say that divorce is usual. Divorce is, in fact, expected. That means that then marriage is not what we used to mean by marriage, right? Marriage used to mean for life, till death us do part. Now it doesn't. Now it means for this amount of time. So similarly, we have to rethink what we mean by marriage. And I think it's into that moment of crisis that, gay marriage was able to exploit the uncertainty around the cultural meaning of marriage in order to, have these legal opening to gay marriage. Gay marriage in and of itself is not a very radical thing, but it is an indicator of some shift, some fundamental shift in the way in which we're thinking about the relationships between intimacy, sex, companionship, reproduction, and family. These things have shifted irrevocably. So we're in a moment where the architecture of power and its relationship to the body is shifting and changing. We don't know exactly what that will mean 10 years from now because things change so rapidly. But what we do know is that we are living with paradigms that are not the paradigms we were living with even 5 years ago. And that the change is rapid and overwhelming and definitive. You can't go back. So, what is the future? We have to look around. We're already in that future. Election of Donald Trump has had all kinds of effects in the US to do with the, you know, dwindling faith in democracy and sense that the political process doesn't work. And clearly, shift in the understanding of what decency means or the way in which relationships between men and women should be conducted. But it's also about the ascent of a certain kind of white supremacy that now has become normalized and inscribed into everyday political life. That said, LGBT groups are not the target of Donald Trump. It's not clear. He's not a cultural conservative. He is more of a right-wing racist, and as long as there are white LGBT people who find benefit in some of the policies that Trump champions, he also receives support of some LGBT people. 14% of LGBT people voted for Trump. That doesn't sound like much, but that's actually a pretty significant number of probably mostly white men who felt that it would be financially good for them to vote for somebody who was going to, lower taxes. But there are also lots of gays and lesbians who, like Trump, think that Islam is a big problem for them and that allowing Muslim immigrants into the country is going to produce new forms of homophobia. That's honestly how some white gay lesbian people think. It's the same in Europe, in Holland and in other places. There have been intersections between anti-immigrant movements and pro-LGBT movements. That same nexus is operating in the US and means that it's not so obvious that Trump is anti-gay or that LGBT people are anti-Trump. So this is a moment to abandon identity politics and think in terms of new forms of solidarity around the issues where there is obvious danger and precarity in terms of the new reality that Trump is creating.
So the Brandon Archive is a chapter of Halberstam's book In a Queer Time and Place. And Halberstam thinks about loss and the ways that Brandon Tina's life is made sense of and death. But Halberstam is also critical of the ways that Philip, who was a person of color, who Brandon Tina was friends with, is not archived in the same way. And Halberstam comes back to these uncomfortable questions of intersectionality and the ways that trans people of color and queer people of color are not necessarily remembered in the way that Brandon is as someone who is imagined to have been, yes, a white man. But the politics of class are really central to the ways that Brandon Tina is thought of as being automatically, say, a full citizen, someone who would be used in future nation building rather than a working class person who had problems with money, job security, housing, and the criminal justice system. And so this kind of scripting of the working class is really about breaking apart the working class into categories of persons who are deemed to be deviant as opposed to those who are not. And I would argue that racial antagonism and class antagonism has always served the interests of the ruling class. So imagining that working class people of color are actually part of an ethnic community rather than a class of people, and imagining that white working class people are also part of an ethnic group rather than a class of people serves the interest of the ruling class. And this could also be true of queer and trans politics. What does it mean to turn grief into grievance? The politics of loss is central to how we understand violence. So we grieve, obviously, for Brandon Tina, who was murdered. But what does it mean to turn this specific sense of grief into grievance, as opposed to having grievance and grief for many people of color, including trans and queer people of color, who are also subject to violence? Ultimately, writes Halberstam, the Brandon Archive is not simply the true story of a young queer misfit in rural North America. It is also a necessarily incomplete and ever-expanding record of how we select our heroes, as well as how we commemorate our dead. The cowardice of this time and place, writes James Baldwin, this era, is nowhere more clearly revealed than in the perpetual attempt to make the public and social disaster the result or the issue of a single demented creature. So the single demented creature, for Halberstam and for critical queer theorists and critical race theorists, is not this one person like Bradley Barton or Nissen, or these working class men who, one could argue, lost their minds in North America and killed others and raped and killed others. It is obviously a function of systemic violence and also the brutalities of the class structure itself. The stories we collect in the Brandon Archive should stretch far beyond the usual tales of love and hate and the various narratives of accommodation. This archive lends us precisely the kind of evidence for things not seen that Baldwin sought. And in the end, if we read it right, it may tell us a different story about late 20th century desire, race, and geography. Story is one of class antagonism, and it does not justify, but it does explain why many people who are minorities in some way strive for class mobility and protection in large cities, and large cities with CCTV cameras, and large cities with lots of aggressive capitalist competition, that would perhaps lead to material success, and success that would allow one to use one's capital against others and to protect oneself. However, this narrative of class mobility is not revolutionary, and ultimately, the story of class antagonism that leads to murder in a small rural working class place, and cases of murder where the working class kill each other, is about power. So I will finish with this quote by Arundhati Roy. Sometimes I think the world is divided into those who have a comfortable relationship with power and those who have a naturally adversarial relationship with power. So I'll finish there. So thank you for attending this lecture. I hope that you are finding the lectures enjoyable and useful. Please feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.